Hi, this is David Christopher Lane, and welcome to Neural Surfer, where we explore consciousness, philosophy, science, machine intelligence, and the enduring power of classic literature. This original story has been fermenting in my mind for years. The Cartographers of the Mind asks a dangerous question. What if the greatest illusion is not religion, nor politics, nor technology, but the belief that you are thinking freely? Set in Istanbul, where ancient mysticism meets modern infrastructure, it follows an engineer who understands electrical currents, but must confront the deeper currents shaping judgment, ego, fear, and belonging. This is not just a story about a city. It is a story about perception, about rising above reflex, about seeing the pattern. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it.
I came to Istanbul to fix the power grid, track the faults, keep the lights on. But in a forgotten rug shop, I met a man who mapped a different kind of current.
The mind is a maze of wires, Evan. Touch one, the whole city flickers.
Prologue: The Drone That Never Lands. When I was a child in Halifax, my father kept an ant farm on his desk, a clear acrylic box with narrow tunnels carved through sand. He would lean over it after work, still in his steel-toe boots, and watch the ants do their narrow, tireless labor. He didn't speak about them the way people speak about pets. He spoke the way engineers speak about systems. "They're solving routing," he'd say, as if the ants were developing a municipal plan. They're distributing load. If an ant died, the others dragged it away without ceremony. If food appeared, the colony shifted as if a single mind had inhaled. I understood even then that the word individual meant something different inside that box. Years later, in university, I saw fish from a pier on the Atlantic, a dark braid of movement under sun glitter. The school of them turned in synchrony, a living lens responding to pressure waves, to threat, to hunger, to the simple mathematics of don't be the slowest dot. From above, the pattern was obvious. From inside, each fish would have felt only muscle and water, only the emergency of the next second. I used to think humans were different because we have language and museums and constitutions, because we name our feelings and sign treaties. But whenever I watched crowds, after a hockey win, after a subway delay, after a rumor, something in me returned to that ant farm. Something in me wondered whether consciousness was a spotlight on a stage whose machinery is mostly hidden. I did not come to Istanbul looking for mysticism. I came for a contract. The company I worked for in Canada had partnered with a Turkish firm on grid modernization, protection relays, smart substations, and the kind of quiet infrastructure nobody thinks about until it fails. My specialization was power electronics, converters, harmonics, switching, the invisible violence of current when it's forced to behave. Istanbul needed more capacity and more stability. A city with 16 million people and more mosques than I could count, balanced on fault lines, could not afford the luxury of romantic blackouts. On my first weekend there, after 5 days of meetings conducted through a translator who made everything sound like a polite ultimatum, I stood on the roof of my building in Kadıköy and watched the city from above. Ferries slid across the Bosphorus like slow electrons moving between plates. Cars formed bright filaments on bridges. Minarets punctured the dusk. I had the sudden, uncomfortable sense that the city was not built so much as grown, layer over layer, centuries of decisions sedimented into stone and asphalt the way coral becomes an island. And in that height, my brief, stolen altitude, I felt what I had rarely felt in Canada, the urge to stop judging. It wasn't virtue, it was geometry. From above, a traffic jam is not an insult. It's a constraint in a network. A shouted argument is not a moral failure. It's information exchange under stress. A rumor is not stupidity. It's a mimetic organism seeking replication. I didn't have that view for long. The roof door clanged. Someone came up to smoke. I descended into the stairwell, back into the forest of faces where every gesture seems personal. On Monday, I met the man who would teach me how to climb without leaving the ground. 1. A city that conducts. My office was on the European side, near Sicily, in a building that wanted to look like Frankfurt. It had reflective glass and a lobby that smelled faintly of citrus cleaning solution, and a security guard who nodded each morning as if he'd been assigned to my life. The commute from Kadikoy was an education in layered systems. I took the Marmaray under the water, where the train moved like a pulse through a submerged artery. People scrolled on phones, stared at ads, held prayer beads, carried bread. I tried for the first month to maintain the posture of a foreign professional, neutral, contained, always slightly polite. But Istanbul does not let you remain a spectator. It is too loud, too intimate, too old. The city has the texture of a story that refuses an ending. In meetings, my Turkish colleagues were warm in ways that startled me. They argued with precision, then offered tea as if conflict had been a small exercise to keep the mind limber. They used honorifics the way my professors used equations, carefully with awareness of hierarchy and consequence. One of them, a project manager named Murat, noticed how I studied people when I thought nobody was watching. "You always look," he said, not unkindly. "I'm adjusting," I answered. "To what?" "To the density." I meant the density of history, of proximity. In Canada, you can go a whole day without brushing another person's sleeve. In Istanbul, your life is braided with strangers before breakfast. Murat smiled the way someone smiles at a mild self-deception. "There is a place," he said, "where you can look without feeling guilty." He wrote an address on a sticky note and folded it with unnecessary care, as if the paper might overhear. "It's a carpet workshop," he added. "Old style, you will like, patterns, systems." I didn't go that week. I was busy with protective coordination studies and the politics of procurement. But the note stayed in my wallet, warming against my credit cards and foreign currency like a seed. On Saturday, after a morning spent battling my washing machine, which behaved as if it took pleasure in ambiguity, I took the ferry to Eminönü and walked uphill into the older parts of the city. The streets narrowed into corridors where commerce and devotion shared walls. A butcher displayed lamb hearts beside a shop selling prayer caps. Tourists wandered with the loose attention of migrating birds. Locals moved with purposeful speed, threading through the chaos like trained signals. The address led me away from the most visible maze of the Grand Bazaar and into a quieter neighborhood where buildings leaned slightly, as if tired of holding themselves upright for so many centuries. The workshop was behind a wooden door with a brass handle worn smooth by hands. There was no sign. If I hadn't been looking for it, I might have assumed it was storage. I knocked. After a moment, the door opened, and an old man stood there with a face that seemed assembled from patience. His eyebrows were white and thick, like brushstrokes. His hair was close-cropped. He wore a dark sweater and simple trousers, nothing theatrical, nothing that tried to persuade me of his importance. He looked at me as if he already knew what I'd come to ask, and had been waiting for my courage to arrive. "You are late," he said in English, then paused, as if tasting the phrase. "But you are here." "I'm sorry," I said automatically, because my Canadian reflexes are trained to apologize even to weather. "Murat gave me this address." The old man nodded once and stepped aside. "Come." Inside, the air smelled of wool, dye, and tea. Light entered from a high window and landed on hanging carpets like sun on sediment. The colors weren't the bright synthetic reds and blues I'd seen in tourist shops. These were deeper, quieter, madder root red, indigo that looked almost black, green that carried a trace of olive. Looms stood like wooden skeletons. Strips of half-finished carpet extended downward, their patterns emerging with deliberate slowness. On a low table, a samovar hissed gently, as if the room breathed through it. The old man sat on a cushion and gestured for me to sit opposite. His movements were economical, without hurry. "My name is Aziz," he said. "Some call me Usta Aziz. If you call me Aziz, it is enough." "Evan," I replied, "Evan Hart." He looked at my hands, not my face, as though my work lived there. "Electrical," he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. He poured tea into small glasses shaped like tulips. The tea was dark, almost opaque, and it carried a scent that reminded me of late nights in labs. Something burnt, something awake. You work with currents, he said. You work with what cannot be held. I work with what can be measured. He smiled faintly. You measure what you can. Then you call the rest noise. That line should have annoyed me. It sounded like a fortune cookie with a university degree. But his voice carried no performance. He spoke the way people speak when they've stopped needing to impress. On the wall behind him hung a carpet unlike the others. It was not decorative. It was diagrammatic. At first, I thought it was a stylized garden scene, but the longer I looked, the more it resembled a field map. Lines curved and braided, shapes repeated at different scales. The whole piece had the feeling of a system in equilibrium. Aziz noticed my gaze. You see it, he said. It looks like streamlines, I answered, surprising myself. Like the lines you draw around magnets, he said, or like the paths fish make when you watch them from above. I laughed once, a short sound. That's a specific comparison. He lifted one shoulder. Everything repeats, only the material changes. I drank my tea. It was hot enough to force attention. In that moment, the city outside, its horns, its calls, its commerce, receded, and the room became a chamber of slow time. I don't know much about carpets, I admitted. Aziz picked up a bundle of dyed yarn and held it between his fingers. You know about codes, he said. This is code, knot by knot. He took a small knife and trimmed a loose end, careful as a surgeon. Weavers learn by imitation, he went on. Apprentice watches master. Hands learn what words cannot. After years, the apprentice thinks he is making his own pattern, but the pattern is older than him. It comes from village, from tribe, from trade routes, from war, from prayer. It lives in the hands. He let the yarn fall back into its bundle. You are here because you want to see the pattern without being trapped inside it. My mouth went dry. It wasn't prophecy. It was recognition. And recognition is often unsettling. I'm here because Murat said I'd like the patterns, I said, trying to be light. Aziz looked at me with an expression that suggested humor could be respected without being followed. Murat is kind, he said. He sends people to me when they begin to feel the city. The city? The human city, he answered. Not Istanbul. Istanbul is only one skin. That was the first time he used the kind of phrase that could have belonged to a mystic. He didn't lean into it. He didn't decorate it. He stated it like a technician naming a component. He stood and walked to a loom where a carpet was mid-creation. He ran his finger along a row of knots. Do you judge ants? He asked. No. Why not? They're ants. He nodded. And you? I hesitated. I'm human. Aziz returned to his cushion, sat, and poured more tea. You're also an animal, he said. An animal who believes he is a judge. The line landed in my chest with a weight I didn't want to admit. Outside, someone called out in Turkish. A child laughed. A door slammed. Inside, the workshop held a quiet that did not fight the noise. It simply existed beside it. Aziz looked at me again, not unkindly. Come back, he said. It was not an invitation, it was instruction. 2, the ordinary faces of a hidden school. I returned the next Saturday, then the next. At first I told myself it was curiosity, an engineer's hunger for pattern. I told myself it was the tea, the quiet, the relief of being somewhere that didn't demand constant social competence. But within a month, I began to plan my week around those visits, as if the workshop were a second office where the work was less visible but more essential. Aziz did not lecture. He did not hand me a book and say, read this and your life will change. He did something stranger. He let me observe. Sometimes he worked while I sat. He tied knots with a speed that wasn't flashy, just steady. Sometimes he had visitors, and I watched them enter like ordinary citizens. Women carrying groceries, men in office clothes, a young guy with a mechanic's hands, an elderly woman whose scarf was tied with careless elegance. They greeted Aziz with a respect that wasn't submissive. It had the texture of familial loyalty, the kind you give to someone who has seen you at your worst and remained unshocked. They drank tea. They spoke about mundane things: rent, a cousin's illness, a broken refrigerator, the rising price of onions. Then, without ceremony, the conversation would shift into deeper territory, as if the mundane were only the doorway. One afternoon, a woman around my age arrived with a notebook under her arm. She wore jeans and a long coat. Her hair was tucked under a simple headscarf, not in a way meant to broadcast piety, but in a way that seemed practical. Aziz introduced her as Layla. She writes. Layla's English was fluent, with the faint accent of someone who had spent time in London or Toronto. She glanced at me, then back at Aziz, as if deciding how much of her attention I deserved. Aziz poured tea. Layla asked in Turkish, something that made Aziz smile. Then Aziz turned to me. Layla asks if you believe in free will. I expected philosophy from him by then, but I didn't expect it to arrive so bluntly. I believe in constrained choice, I said, which is what I say when I don't want to sound naive or cynical. Layla's eyebrows rose slightly. Constrained by what? I looked at her notebook. By wiring, I said. By biology, by culture, by what we don't notice. Aziz gave a small nod, as if I'd answered a test he hadn't admitted he was giving. Layla tapped her notebook once. That is close, she said, to what we are doing. What are you doing? I asked. She looked at Aziz first, and he didn't stop her. We map, she said. Not cities, not markets. We map the mind. Psychology? I asked, skeptical. Layla's mouth tightened briefly, as if the word was too thin for what she meant. More like ecology, she replied. The mind is not one thing, it is a habitat. Aziz added almost casually, and we learn to live there without killing everything. That line stayed with me for days. It hinted at something I recognized but couldn't easily describe. The way people burn their own inner forests with judgment, resentment, shame, then act surprised when they feel barren. Over the next weeks, I met more of Aziz's visitors. There was Cem, a ferry captain with a weathered face and a laugh that burst out without permission. There was Dr. Selin, an oncologist who spoke softly and looked at people as if she could see how fragile their cells were. There was Farouk, an accountant who carried worry like a second spine. There was Emre, a mechanic who fixed motorcycles and listened more than he spoke. They did not look like members of a secret society. They looked like the city itself, a cross-section of ordinary survival. And yet each of them had a particular attentiveness, a habit of watching themselves while they spoke, as if they didn't fully trust their first impulses. One day, when the workshop was crowded, Aziz asked me to help carry a rolled carpet into a back room. The back room was smaller and darker, with shelves stacked with old textiles. The smell was stronger there, wool and dust and something faintly medicinal. When we set the carpet down, Aziz did not leave immediately. He stood beside it, his hands resting on the roll as if feeling its history through the fabric. You have noticed, he said, that these people are not special. I didn't know what answer he wanted. They seem grounded, I offered. They are not saints, he said. They are not performers. They are not trying to be admired. This is important. Important for what? Aziz looked at me, and for once his expression sharpened. Because if you want the bird's view, he said, you must stop looking for birds. I didn't understand, so I stayed silent. Aziz continued. In the old days there were techies, he said, referring to Sufi lodges. Some were pure, some became political, some became business. Then the state closed them. Some deserved it, some did not. He spoke without bitterness. It wasn't nostalgia. It was context. What remains, he went on, is what cannot be closed, a way of seeing, a discipline. He lifted his hand, palm up. If you gather people who want to be special, you create a circus. If you gather people who want to be ordinary with open eyes, you create a school. A school, I repeated. Aziz's palm closed into a loose fist. Not with diplomas. He stepped past me and opened the back door. A narrow alley ran behind the building lined with laundry and satellite dishes. A cat watched us with mild contempt. Aziz gestured for me to follow him outside. We walked a few meters down the alley and stopped by a wall where vines climbed through cracks in plaster. He pointed at the vines. Life finds roots, he said, even when walls are built. I began to suspect that the workshop was not a business with a spiritual hobby. It was a spiritual practice disguised as a business, which made it harder for the world to punish. In Istanbul, disguise is a form of intelligence. 3. The Sufi who spoke like a physicist. Aziz never claimed a title. Nobody called him Sheikh in front of me. They called him Usta, which means master craftsman, a word that can apply to carpentry or to life. Sometimes when we were alone, I asked him questions the way I asked my professors. Direct, impatient, built on the assumption that answers exist. He tolerated my questions without rewarding my impatience. One rainy afternoon, I arrived irritated by a workplace argument about procurement. Someone had pushed for a cheaper vendor with dubious credentials. My objections had been received with polite smiles, as if my expertise were an aesthetic preference rather than a risk calculation. I sat in Aziz's workshop with my wet jacket hanging from a hook, and I spoke too fast. They don't listen, I said. They care more about relationships than about the technical facts. Aziz tied knots without looking up. I waited for him to take my side. He didn't. After a minute, he said, "Do you know why people gossip?" It was such a sideways question that it disarmed me. Because they're bored. Aziz's knife moved. Snip, snip. Gossip is a social sensor, he said, a way to map alliances, to detect threats, to measure who is safe. It is older than your spreadsheets. I bristled. So what? We should respect gossip? Aziz finally looked up. Respect is not worship, he said. Respect is accuracy. That word, accuracy, hit me like a familiar tool. Engineers worship accuracy. It is the religion of people who build things that can kill you if you lie. Aziz continued. You think they do not listen to facts, but they are listening to different facts. They are listening to the facts of belonging. I exhaled slowly. That doesn't help when the transformer fails. Aziz's eyes softened. It helps you predict, he said, and prediction is mercy. Mercy? If you predict, you stop being surprised. If you stop being surprised, you stop being cruel. He returned his gaze to the carpet. In my head, I heard the language of evolutionary biology, which I'd studied only enough to feel literate. Humans as social primates, our brains built to navigate status, coalitions, reputation. Technical truth is one currency, but belonging is often the currency that keeps a group alive long enough to use technical truth. Aziz spoke again, as if he'd overheard my thoughts. You want them to be rational, he said. But what is rational? To choose the best option based on evidence. Aziz's hands paused. Evidence for what? He asked. The question hung there, plain and difficult. For success, I said. Aziz's mouth curved slightly. Success in what environment? Under what selection pressure? There it was, selection pressure, spoken in the same tone someone might say rainfall or market forces. He was not quoting Darwin to sound modern. He was using Darwin the way he used wool as material. He resumed tying knots. In your office, he said, the environment rewards coalition. The selection pressure is social. The organism adapts. You're comparing my colleagues to organisms, I said, half accusing. Aziz looked up again. "And you are not?" he asked. I had no clever reply. That day, he showed me something in the carpet he was making. It was a small asymmetry, a knot slightly out of alignment, almost invisible unless you searched. "This," he said, "is intentional." "Why?" I asked. "To keep the ego from worshipping perfection," he replied. "To remind the hands that only God is without flaw. The carpet is for humans." I'd heard of such practices, imperfections woven into designs to avoid hubris. But in his hands, it became more than superstition. It became a design principle. Build systems that tolerate error because error is built into the builder. In power engineering, we do the same. We design with margins, redundancy, fail-safes, not because we believe in failure, but because we believe in reality. I began to see that Aziz's mysticism was not opposed to science. It was a parallel discipline, a way of building inner systems that didn't collapse under load. One evening, after the others had left, Aziz poured tea and asked me a question without preface. "Do you know what Sufis call the self that judges?" he said. "I've heard the term nafs," I answered. Aziz nodded. "Nafs is a word that holds many layers," he said. "Some translate it as ego, some as soul, some as lower self. It is not one thing. It is a swarm." "A swarm," I repeated. Aziz's eyes held mine. "Like ants," he said. And in that moment, my childhood ant farm returned, not as nostalgia, but as a model. The NAF's colony, countless impulses, each doing its job, each convinced it is necessary, altogether producing something that feels like me. Aziz sipped his tea. "Your engineers," he said, "build grids so the city does not burn. We build grids so the heart does not burn." The word heart in his mouth did not mean sentiment. It meant center. It meant the part of you that can see without being hijacked. That was the beginning of my education. 4. The league that didn't want to be seen. I learned about the league the way you learn about a hidden current, by observing what moves even when nobody admits it exists. At first, I thought Aziz's workshop was simply a gathering place, a modern, informal substitute for the lodges that had been closed in the early Republic. I assumed the school was a loose community of people trying to stay sane. Then I noticed patterns. Certain people arrived on certain days. Some stayed in the main room, others were invited to the back. A few times after evening prayer, the workshop lights stayed on longer than usual, and when I passed by later, coming from dinner with colleagues, I could hear low voices, not loud enough to pass, but steady, as if a meeting were underway. One night, Layla texted me in English, "Come tomorrow, earlier. Don't be late." I arrived at the workshop an hour before noon, which in my Canadian mind felt like a small violation of weekend laziness. The door was already unlocked. Inside, the main room was empty, but the back room glowed with lamplight. I heard the low hiss of the samovar. I stepped in and found 5 people sitting in a circle on cushions. Aziz, Layla, Dr. Selin, Chem the ferry captain, and a man I hadn't met before, slim and quiet, wearing a plain jacket. His hair was black with a streak of grey that looked like a deliberate mark. Aziz gestured for me to sit. Nobody smiled in greeting. It wasn't hostility. It was a different mode, a seriousness that didn't need facial decoration. Aziz spoke first. "This is not a gathering for comfort," he said. "This is for work." He nodded toward the man with the grey streak. "This is Yusuf," he said. "He studies numbers." Yusuf's eyes met mine briefly. "Not numbers," he said softly. "Patterns." Aziz poured tea for everyone, then set the glasses down like pieces on a board. Layla opened her notebook. "We will begin," she said. My instinct was to ask, "Begin what?" But something in the room asked for restraint. I stayed silent. Aziz looked at each of us in turn. "We are here," he said, "because the mind lies." He let the sentence settle, as if it were a stone dropped into water. "The mind lies," he repeated, "not because it is evil, but because it is ancient. It was built for survival, not for truth. Truth is sometimes useful, sometimes dangerous. The mind chooses. Dr. Salien nodded once, her face unreadable. Aziz continued. Some people want to escape the mind. They try to shut it down. They become dull. Some people worship the mind. They become clever and cruel. He held his hands apart, as if indicating two cliffs with a valley between. We learn a third way, he said, to see the mind as it is, to learn its habits, to predict it, to rise above its judgments without pretending we have no judgments. Cem shifted on his cushion. His hands were large, the hands of someone who grips ropes and wheels. So, Cem said, we are mechanics. Aziz's mouth curved. Yes, he said, but the engine is inside. Layla wrote something down quickly. Yusuf watched the movement of her pen as if even that had meaning. Aziz looked at me. Evan, he said, you work with invisible forces. Tell us, how do you see something you cannot see? I felt every eye on me. In engineering, I said, we infer, we measure effects, voltage, current, heat. We build models. The models aren't reality, but they're useful. Aziz nodded. And if the model fails, we update. Aziz's gaze sharpened slightly. And if the ego loves the old model? The question was aimed at me, but also at everyone. It wasn't accusation. It was diagnosis. Layla spoke. We cling, she said, even when the model hurts us. Aziz turned back to me. Here, he said, we update. But the updating is not only intellectual, it is embodied. It is ethical. It is spiritual. The word spiritual did not float. It landed. Yusuf spoke then, his voice low. We call ourselves, he said, the Harry Tassila. Layla translated, though I had already learned the basic Turkish. The Cartographers. We map, Yusuf continued, the terrain of human nature, not to control others, to stop being controlled. Dr. Selin added, so we can do less harm. Aziz's eyes rested on me again. This is not secret because it is dramatic, he said. It is quiet because it is dangerous. Dangerous to who? I asked. Aziz didn't answer immediately. He took a sip of tea as if the question required patience. Dangerous to the ego, he said finally. And the ego protects itself with noise. If you threaten the ego, it calls you heretic, traitor, naive, arrogant. It uses any label that will keep it safe. I thought of my office arguments, the subtle ways people dismissed inconvenient truths. I thought of how quickly humans create categories. Friend, enemy, respectable, ridiculous. Aziz spoke again. Also, he added, dangerous to those who profit from confusion. That was the closest he came to politics. Layla flipped a page in her notebook. Today, she said, we observe one mechanism. She looked at each of us. Judgment, she said. Aziz raised a hand slightly, not to stop her, but to frame the work. Judgment, he said, is a tool. Without it, you cannot choose. But in most people, judgment becomes identity. They do not use judgment. They are judgment. He looked at me, and I felt the accuracy of it in my own mind. How often had I thought of myself as the one who sees, the one who knows, the one who is correct? Aziz continued. Sufis speak of polishing the mirror, he said. Not to see angels, to see what is already there, without distortion. Yusuf added, a mirror that thinks it is a hammer will break everything it touches. Nobody laughed. It wasn't a joke. It was a warning. We spent the next 2 hours doing something that would have looked unimpressive to an outsider, recounting recent moments when we judged someone, then tracing the underlying mechanism. Aziz asked questions like an interrogator who didn't want confessions, only clarity. What did you assume? What did you fear? What did you gain from the judgment? What did the judgment protect? Cem spoke about a passenger he'd secretly despised for complaining. Dr. Selin spoke about a colleague who'd taken credit for her work. Layla spoke about her mother. Yusuf spoke about himself with a precision that felt surgical. When it was my turn, I spoke about a Turkish engineer at my office, Arda, who I'd labeled incompetent because he didn't follow my documentation style. Aziz listened without blinking. Then he asked, "What did Arda protect by ignoring your style?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" Aziz's voice remained calm. "If you assume incompetence," he said, "you stop asking deeper questions. You preserve your model." Layla's pen moved. Aziz leaned slightly forward. "Maybe Arda protects status. Maybe he protects speed. Maybe he protects his role as the one who knows local ways. Your judgment keeps you from seeing him." I felt heat in my face. Not shame exactly, but the sensation of a mental circuit overloaded by new current. Aziz added, "When you judge, you simplify. Simplification is sometimes needed. But if you simplify a human, you will become blind." Yusuf spoke softly. "Blindness is expensive." That session ended without ceremony. Aziz did not declare me initiated. He didn't hand me a ring. He simply said, "Come again." I walked out into the street feeling as if the city had changed scale. Faces in the crowd looked less like individuals and more like moving solutions to invisible equations. Each person was an adaptive response, a bundle of learned rules, ancient instincts, cultural scripts. I felt for the first time the faint outline of the drone view, not as arrogance but as humility. Because from above, nobody is a villain. They are variables. Besinci Istanbul as a laboratory. My work week became a series of controlled experiments without my consent. In the office, I watched my own mind more closely. When someone interrupted me, I observed the surge of irritation like a voltage spike. When someone praised my contribution, I noticed how my chest warmed and my posture rose, the body's ancient reward system celebrating status. I began to see my emotions less as moral signals and more as evolved algorithms. This did not make me cold. It made me curious. In the evenings, I'd walk through Kadikoy's streets, past fish sellers and bookstores, and watch the dance of human coordination, how people shifted to avoid collisions, how couples negotiated speed without speaking, how men formed clusters outside cafes like particles in a low-energy state. Sometimes I'd ride the ferry just to sit and watch the passenger ecology, teenagers clustering at the railings, older men claiming corners, tourists scanning maps with the anxious confidence of people who believe maps prevent error. Once, a small argument flared near the snack counter. A man accused another of cutting in line. Their voices rose. People turned their heads, forming a loose circle of attention. The argument was not about bread. It was about status and fairness and humiliation. In my old mode, I would have chosen sides. I would have judged. I would have thought, that man is rude, or that man is oversensitive. Now I watched the mechanism, two primates negotiating hierarchy in a crowded habitat. The crowd's attention functioning as a social amplifier. The insult as a threat to rank. I felt my own mind reaching for moral conclusions, the same way a hand reaches for a railing in a moving train. I didn't forbid it. I simply saw it. Later in Aziz's workshop, I told them about the ferry argument. Aziz listened, then asked, "What did you feel?" "Annoyance," I admitted. Then curiosity. "And what did you judge?" I considered. "I judged myself," I said, "for wanting to judge them." Layla smiled briefly, the first smile in days. "Welcome," she said. Aziz's eyes softened. "The ego is clever," he said. "If you stop judging others, it judges you for judging. It will keep the throne by changing costumes." Yusuf added, "A king who changes clothes is still a king." Aziz poured tea. "We do not kill the king," he said. "We relocate him. The ego becomes a servant, not a ruler." The language was symbolic, but the process felt technical. In control systems, you don't eliminate feedback. You tune it. You stabilize it. You prevent oscillation. I began to bring scientific language into our discussions, and Aziz didn't flinch. One night I spoke about attractors in dynamical systems, how complex systems can settle into stable patterns of behavior, repeating the same loops even when the environment changes. Aziz nodded. The NAFs has attractors, he said. Anger is one, pride is one, self-pity is one. Yusuf leaned forward slightly. And what is the method, he asked, to leave an attractor? In math, I said, you need energy to push the system out, a perturbation. Aziz tapped the edge of his tea glass. In this work, he said, the perturbation is remembrance. Remembrance of what? I asked. Aziz's answer was quiet. Of what you are, he said, and what you are not. That sentence could have been empty, but coming from him it carried weight, because Aziz didn't speak as if he possessed special access to God. He spoke as if he was trying, daily, to remain aligned with reality. He began to teach me, gradually, the Sufi vocabulary, not as exotic poetry, but as operational terms. Maqam, a station, a stable phase in the journey. Hal, a state, passing, not owned. Adab, the discipline of conduct, not etiquette for impressing, but manners as technology. Dhikr, remembrance, repetition as recalibration. Fana, the fading of self-importance, not annihilation, but decentering. Baka, returning to the world with less distortion. Each concept felt, in my engineer's mind, like a tool, not a belief, a tool. The League did not ask me to convert. It asked me to observe. And observation, when done honestly, changes the observer. 6. The carpet as a model of mind. One afternoon, Aziz asked me to help with dyeing wool. We went to a small courtyard behind the workshop where large pots simmered over gas burners. The air smelled of damp fiber and plant matter. Bundles of wool soaked in dark liquid like organs in a lab jar. Aziz lifted a strand and let it drip back into the pot. Color, he said, is memory. How? I asked. Because it holds the story of what touched it, he said. Root, leaf, heat, time, even the water matters. The same recipe in another village makes another red. He looked at me. People are like this. I watched the wool darken. Same genes, I said. Different environment. Aziz nodded. And then they claim their color is moral superiority. He said it without sarcasm. It was a plain observation. We carried dyed wool inside and hung it to dry. The strands looked like hanging rivers. In the main room, Aziz unrolled a carpet that was finished but not trimmed. The pattern was intricate, repeating medallions nested inside borders, each smaller motif echoing the larger, like a fractal. I leaned close and saw that within one medallion, tiny shapes repeated the whole design at miniature scale. It's recursive, I said, unable to hide my excitement. Aziz smiled, not at my excitement, but at my recognition. Yes, he said. The pattern repeats. The eye learns the logic and then can predict the next move. He handed me a magnifying lens. Look closer, he said. Through the lens, I saw that each knot was slightly irregular, not sloppy, alive. The pattern was precise, but it was made by hands, not by a machine, and the hands left traces of breath. Aziz sat beside me. A carpet, he said, is a compromise between rule and variation. Like genetics, I said, thinking of mutation and selection. Aziz's eyes narrowed slightly, approving. Yes, he said. Rules allow life to persist. Variation allows life to adapt. He pointed at a small motif near the border, two birds facing each other, their beaks almost touching. In some villages, he said, this means marriage. In some it means rivalry. In some it means the soul speaking to itself. The symbol adapts. Layla entered quietly and sat with us. She watched the carpet for a long time without speaking. Finally, she said, when I write, I do the same. I build a pattern, then I let it break in controlled ways. Aziz nodded. Controlled breaks, he said, prevent uncontrolled breaks. Again, engineering language in spiritual clothing. Aziz looked at me. In your work, he said, you design protections. If something goes wrong, you isolate the fault. You keep the rest of the system alive. Yes, I said. Here, he said, tapping his chest lightly, we learn to isolate faults in the mind. Anger arises, fault. Pride arises, fault. We do not let one fault cascade into total collapse. I thought of blackouts, one-line trips, then another, then a cascade, and suddenly a city goes dark. Aziz spoke softly. Judgment cascades, he said. One insult becomes a war. One fear becomes oppression. One shame becomes cruelty. Layla added, we stop the cascade. How? I asked. Aziz's answer was not dramatic. Practice, he said, daily, like you do not study electricity once and then forget. You study until it lives in your hands. I understood then why the League stayed quiet. A group of people seriously studying the mechanisms of judgment is a threat to any society built on easy outrage. Such people are difficult to recruit into tribal frenzy. They become less profitable. That afternoon, Aziz taught me to tie a knot. My fingers fumbled. The wool resisted. My impatience rose like heat. Aziz watched without criticism. After my third crooked knot, I swore under my breath. Aziz's eyes flicked to mine. There, he said. What? Your mind, he said. It used shame as a whip. It thinks pain is the only motivator. I stared at the knot, embarrassed by the exposure. Aziz continued. Now, he said, tie the next knot without punishment. It was a simple instruction. It was also extremely hard. I breathed slowly and tied the next knot with more care. It wasn't perfect, but it held. Aziz nodded once, and that nod felt like a quiet blessing. 7. The Night of Remembrance. I had heard of Dhikr ceremonies, the repetition of divine names, the chanting, the movement. Tourists saw Mevlevi whirling shows and called it spiritual entertainment. I had avoided them out of suspicion. Anything that could be packaged for foreigners could also be emptied. Aziz did not invite me to a formal ceremony for months. When he did, there was no glamour in the invitation. Tonight, he said, after midnight. Layla texted me an address that was not a public venue. It was in Üsküdar, on the Asian side, in a neighborhood where narrow streets climbed toward old wooden houses. I arrived on foot, the city quieter than usual, as if holding its breath. Cats moved through shadows with their usual sovereignty. The building was modest, no sign, no ornamentation. A single light glowed behind a curtained window. Inside, shoes were stacked by the door. I followed the faint sound of voices into a room with low cushions arranged in a circle. There were perhaps 20 people, men and women, young and old, dressed plainly. I recognized some faces from the workshop, and some I'd never seen. They sat with a stillness that felt practiced, not stiff. Aziz was there, seated near the wall. He did not take the center. Nobody did. A man with a shaved head began to recite quietly in Arabic, verses I couldn't follow. The cadence mattered more than comprehension. The sound was like a slow wave against stone. Then, without announcement, the group began to repeat a phrase, simple, steady, like a metronome for the nervous system. I sat and listened. At first my mind tried to label the experience, ritual, group chant, altered state. Then it tried to evaluate. Is this manipulation? Is it safe? Is it superstition? The analytical circuits fired as if threatened, but the repetition continued, and something else happened. The mind grew bored. The ego, deprived of novelty, lost interest. The sound became a field. I remembered something from physics. When you drive a system at a certain frequency, you can pull it into coherence. Resonance can be destructive, bridges collapsing, glass shattering, but it can also be stabilizing. A pendulum can synchronize with another. Fireflies can blink in unison. The chant was not magical. It was entrainment. Aziz's face remained calm. His eyes were half closed, not in trance but in attention. As the repetition continued, I noticed how my judgment softened, not out of moral effort, but out of fatigue. The part of me that constantly narrates my identity began to loosen, like a hand unclenching after gripping too long. I did not see visions, I did not float, I did not become a saint. But for a few minutes I experienced something I can only describe as space, a quiet distance between impulse and response. The kind of distance a drone has above a forest, where you can see paths instead of branches. When the chanting ended, silence filled the room. It was not empty, it felt inhabited. No one rushed to speak. Nobody tried to interpret the experience for others. There were no testimonials. After a long pause, Aziz stood. He spoke one sentence in Turkish, and Layla translated softly for me. "Do not worship the state you tasted." Then Aziz looked around the room. "You return," he said, "to the world." I understood. The point was not to escape humanity. The point was to re-enter it with less distortion. Outside, the air was cold, and the city's usual restlessness had returned in small forms. A distant motorbike, a dog barking, a couple arguing quietly. The world did not care about my inner experience, and that indifference was oddly freeing. Layla walked beside me for a while. "You expected fireworks," she said. I shook my head. "I expected something I could describe." Layla nodded. "Description is the ego's hobby," she said. "It wants to own the moment." We stopped at a corner where our paths diverged. Layla looked at me with a seriousness that carried no threat. "This work," she said, "is not a costume. It is surgery. If you only want philosophy, you can read books. If you want change, you have to pay." "Pay how?" I asked. Layla's answer was simple. "With your favorite illusions," she said. Then she walked away, leaving me alone under a street lamp, feeling as if the city itself had become a mirror. 8. The Engineer's Crisis. 2 months later, the project at my office hit a snag that revealed more than technical difficulties. We were integrating a new set of digital relays and communication protocols for substations. The goal was resilience, faster fault detection, better isolation, less downtime. But the same systems that allow rapid control can also be used for surveillance or manipulation, depending on who has access and why. A vendor representative came to the office and gave a presentation that was too smooth. He spoke about visibility and control with the confidence of someone who enjoys power for its own sake. During the Q&A, I asked about security standards and audit transparency. His answers were polished, slightly evasive. After the meeting, Murat pulled me aside. "Be careful," he said quietly. "Careful about what?" I asked. Murat glanced around. "You ask questions?" he said. "Some questions are seen as disrespect." "Security is not disrespect," I said. Murat sighed. "In theory." That night I went to Aziz's workshop carrying my irritation like a live wire. I found him trimming a finished carpet, his knife moving with the calm of habit. I spoke bluntly. "There's corruption," I said. "Or at least careless power." Aziz did not react dramatically. He set the knife down, wiped his hands, and poured tea. "You want to fight," he said. "I want to protect the system," I replied. Aziz nodded once. "Protection is good," he said. "But tell me, what else do you want?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" Aziz's gaze was steady. "Do you want to be right?" he asked. "Do you want to be admired? Do you want to punish? Do you want to feel clean?" The questions landed like blows, not because they were cruel, but because they were accurate in ways I didn't like. I began, then stopped. Aziz waited. Finally, I admitted, "I want to not feel powerless." Aziz nodded, as if that was the real confession. "Powerlessness," he said, "is a fear. Fear is an old mechanism. It makes the mind narrow. It makes you see enemies." "I'm not imagining enemies," I said. Aziz raised a hand slightly. "I did not say you are imagining," he said. "I said the fear changes your sight." He leaned forward. "If you act from fear," he said, "you become predictable. and those who want to control systems love predictable opponents. I stared at my tea. The surface reflected the workshop's light in a dark oval. "So what do I do?" I asked. Aziz's answer was not comforting. "You do the work," he said. "What work?" Aziz tapped his chest lightly again. "You watch," he said. "You watch the mind. You watch the fear. You do not let it drive." "And in the office?" I pressed. Aziz's eyes narrowed slightly. "You speak the truth," he said, "but without ego." "That sounds impossible." Aziz smiled faintly. "It is difficult," he said, "not impossible." Yusuf appeared in the doorway as if summoned by the tension. He sat without greeting. Aziz looked at him. "Evan has met the Serpent of Power," he said. Yusuf's mouth curved slightly. "Everyone meets it," he said. "Most people make it their pet." Aziz turned back to me. "You asked before," he said, "why we are quiet. This is one reason. The world loves confusion. Confusion makes power easy." He lifted a finger. "But do not turn this into a conspiracy story," he said. "That is also ego. Evil is often simple. Hungry people grabbing more than they need." That line punctured my drama. It returned me to reality. Aziz continued. "In evolutionary terms," he said, "humans are primates who learned to accumulate resources beyond immediate need. In some environments, this saved them. In large societies, it becomes exploitation." He spoke as if describing weather patterns. Dr. Selin, who had entered quietly, added, "In my hospital," she said, "I see the same mechanism. People hoard control because they fear death." Aziz looked at me. "Do you see?" he asked. I nodded slowly. "The algorithm," I said. "Fear, status, control." Aziz's eyes softened. "Yes," he said. "Now, if you can see the algorithm, you can rise above the insult. You can act without hatred." Hatred was my hidden fuel. He had named it without accusation. Aziz's voice was quiet. "You can still oppose," he said, "but without becoming the thing you oppose." That sentence became my assignment. In the weeks that followed, I spoke up about security with more strategy and less heat. I documented concerns carefully. I built alliances quietly. I learned to frame my arguments in terms of shared goals rather than personal righteousness. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But even when it didn't, something in me remained less poisoned. I could feel the difference. The old pattern of outrage wanted to own me. The new practice gave me distance. The League was teaching me not how to win, but how to remain intact. 9. Yusuf's numbers and the shape of fate. One evening, after a long day of field testing in a substation where dust coated everything like a second skin, I went to the workshop and found Yusuf alone, sorting through old papers. Aziz was out, Layla absent. The workshop felt emptier without their quiet gravity. Yusuf looked up. "You are tired," he said. "Is it that obvious?" I asked. Yusuf gestured toward a cushion. I sat. He held up a paper covered in diagrams, circles connected by lines, arrows, notes in Turkish and Arabic. "What is that?" I asked. "A model," he said. "Of what?" Yusuf placed the paper on the floor between us. "Of human response," he said. It looked like a network diagram, the kind we use for power grids, nodes, connections, flow paths. "You're mapping minds like circuits," I said, half amused. Yusuf's eyes held mine. "Why do you think that is strange?" he asked. "It's not strange," I admitted. "It's familiar." Yusuf tapped a node on the diagram. "This," he said, "is shame." He tapped another. "This is hunger." Another. "This is belonging." He drew his finger along the lines. "If you stimulate this," he said, "you activate this, then this, then this." He looked up. "Politics is applied psychology," he said. "Marketing is applied psychology. Religion is applied psychology. Even romance." "Are you saying everything is manipulation?" I asked. Yusuf shook his head. "Everything is influence," he corrected. "Manipulation is influence without consent." He leaned back. We do not pretend we are free from influence, he said. We learn the currents. He pointed at the diagram again. In Sufi language, he said, the currents are waswas, whispers, suggestions. The mind whispers and calls it truth. Where do the whispers come from? I asked. Yusuf's eyes narrowed slightly, thoughtful. From the body, he said. From ancestors, from culture, from trauma, from the unseen. The unseen, I repeated, cautious. Yusuf nodded. Not supernatural, he said, anticipating my skepticism. Unseen like microbes are unseen. Unseen like magnetic fields. They exist, they shape, but most people do not notice. He smiled faintly. You work with invisible forces. You should not fear the unseen. I leaned forward, looking at the diagram. Where does choice fit? I asked. Yusuf took a pen and drew a small circle not connected to the rest. Here, he said. It was almost comically small. That's depressing, I said. Yusuf shrugged. It is humbling, he said. Depression is ego mourning its fantasy. His words were sharp, but not cruel. They had the quality of a scalpel cutting away sentimental padding. He continued. When people believe they are fully free, he said, they blame themselves and others excessively. They become harsh. When people believe they are fully determined, he said, they become lazy or fatalistic. He tapped the small circle again. This, he said, is where work happens, not in grand freedom, in small freedom practiced daily. Small freedom, like a control margin, like the little adjustment that prevents a system from oscillating. Yusuf rolled the paper carefully, as if the diagram was sacred. Aziz says you want the drone view, he said. Yes, I admitted. Yusuf looked toward the hanging carpets. A drone view, he said, is not distance. It is perspective. He paused. If you rise above, he said, you do not become superior. You become responsible. The word responsible landed heavier than enlightened, because responsibility is not ecstasy. Responsibility is staying awake when you would rather sleep. 10. The test. A quarrel in the circle. The League did not stage tests. Life staged them. It happened on a winter evening when rain hammered Istanbul like a stubborn hand. The streets shone with puddles. The city smelled of wet stone and exhaust. Aziz had gathered a small group in the workshop, me, Layla, Yusuf, Cem, Dr. Celine, Farouk the accountant, and Emre the mechanic. We sat in a circle, tea glasses steaming. Aziz began with a simple question. What has captured your mind this week? He asked. Cem spoke about an accident on the ferry, a near miss. Dr. Celine spoke about a patient who refused treatment. Farouk spoke about his daughter's university applications. Emre spoke about a motorcycle engine that kept failing despite his repairs. When it was Layla's turn, she hesitated, then said, I've been angry. Aziz nodded. At what? Layla's eyes flicked around the circle, then settled on Farouk. Farouk stiffened slightly. At people who pretend not to see, Layla said. At people who hide behind politeness. Farouk's face tightened. Are you talking about me? He asked. Layla didn't answer immediately. Her silence was an answer. Farouk's voice rose. You always do this, he said. You make everything moral. You think you are the only one with courage. Layla's cheeks flushed. And you think caution is wisdom, she replied. Sometimes it's just fear. The room changed temperature. I felt the shift in my body, the ancient readiness for tribal conflict. My mind wanted to choose sides, to join a coalition, to feel righteous. Aziz did not intervene quickly. He watched, his face calm. Farouk leaned forward. You don't know what it costs, he said. Some of us have families, jobs, consequences. Layla's voice sharpened. And some of us have integrity, she said. The word integrity cracked the air like a whip. Farouk's eyes flashed with hurt. So I'm corrupt? He demanded. Layla opened her mouth to respond, then stopped, as if realizing she had stepped onto a narrow ledge. Aziz spoke then, quietly. Stop, he said, not shouted, not dramatic, just a firm boundary. Both of them went still, like dogs hearing a command. Aziz looked at Farouk. What do you feel? He asked. Farouk's throat worked. Humiliated, he said. Aziz nodded. Then he looked at Layla. What do you feel? Layla's eyes were bright. Furious, she said. And tired. Aziz folded his hands in his lap. Now, he said, do you see the algorithm? Silence. Aziz continued. Farouk, he said, your humiliation is an ancient fear. In a tribe, humiliation meant loss of protection. It meant danger. Farouk's jaw clenched, but he didn't deny it. Aziz turned to Layla. Layla, he said, your fury is also ancient. Injustice triggers rage because rage mobilizes energy. Rage makes you act. Layla's shoulders dropped slightly, as if hearing her own emotion described as a mechanism reduced its tyranny. Aziz looked at both of them. Now, he said, watch how the mind uses these mechanisms to build stories. He looked at Farouk. Your mind says, I am being attacked. I must defend. He looked at Layla. Your mind says, I am surrounded by cowards. I must strike. Aziz's voice remained calm. Both stories feel true, he said. Both stories are incomplete. He paused. Then he said something that shifted the room. You are not enemies, he said. You are two adaptations colliding. Layla blinked as if the phrase had entered her body. Farouk's eyes dropped to his hands. Aziz continued. Layla, he said, you value courage. Farouk values stability. Both values serve life. The problem is when you worship your value and despise the other. He leaned slightly forward. This, he said, is how wars begin. Not with evil, with value turned into identity. I felt my heart slow. The urge to choose sides faded slightly. The drone view returned, not as superiority, but as a wider map. Aziz looked around the circle. Now, he said, each of you, what did you feel when they fought? Chem spoke first. I wanted to laugh, he admitted. Then I wanted to punch someone. I don't know why. Dr. Salin said, I wanted to fix it, like a wound. Emre said, I wanted to leave. Conflict makes my chest tight. Then Aziz looked at me. I swallowed, careful not to dramatize, and spoke honestly. I wanted to judge, I said. I wanted to pick who was right. Aziz nodded. And did you? He asked. I started to, I admitted. Then I remembered the algorithm. Aziz's eyes softened. Good, he said. Not perfect. Good. He turned back to Layla and Farouk. Now, he said, speak again, but speak from the part that sees. Layla stared at the carpet on the wall, then said quietly, I'm afraid, she said. I'm afraid people will keep choosing comfort until everything collapses. Farouk's shoulders slumped. And I'm afraid, he said, that if I choose your kind of courage, my children will pay. The room shifted again. The sharpness dissolved into something more human, more complex. Aziz nodded once. There, he said, 2 fears, 2 loves, no villains. He looked at all of us. This is the work, he said, not to avoid conflict, but to see its mechanics while you are inside it. Later, walking home through rain, I realized something. The League was not teaching peace as a slogan. It was teaching peace as a technical skill, like balancing a grid under fluctuating load. Peace requires understanding currents, otherwise you mistake every surge for betrayal. 11. The physics of rising. My mind kept returning to the idea of rising above, and I worried that the phrase itself carried ego, an image of superiority. I asked Aziz about it on a quiet afternoon when only we were in the workshop. Rising, I said. Sounds like hierarchy. Aziz trimmed a loose thread, then looked up. Does altitude always mean arrogance? He asked. In humans, often? Aziz nodded. Then we must be precise, he said. Rising above judgment does not mean rising above people. It means rising above the reflex. The reflex, I repeated. Aziz gestured toward the carpet on the wall, the one that looked like field lines. Do you know? He asked. What makes iron filings arrange in patterns near a magnet? The magnetic field, I said. And do the filings choose? He asked. No, I said. They respond. Aziz nodded. Most human behavior, he said, is response, stimulus, reflex, story. He held his hands apart as if framing a narrow corridor. Between stimulus and response, he said, there is a space. He did not claim the phrase as his own. He said it like a tool description. That space, he continued, is where you can choose, but you must train to notice it. How? I asked, though I already knew the answer would be practice. Aziz's eyes held mine. By remembering, he said, by catching yourself in small moments. He gave examples, not dramatic ones. When someone cuts in line, he said, and you feel the surge, catch it. When your colleague ignores you, he said, and you build a story, catch it. When you want to be admired, he said, and you pretend it's virtue, catch it. He smiled faintly. The ego is not only in anger, he said. It is also in goodness that wants applause. That line pierced me. I had often wanted to be the noble foreign engineer, the rational one, the ethical one. Even my desire to be above judgment had a hidden desire to be better than those who judge. Aziz continued. Physics has laws, he said. So does the heart. I laughed softly. That's a bold claim. Aziz shrugged. Not laws like equations, he said. Laws like tendencies. If you feed anger, it grows. If you feed humility, it grows. Attention is food. He leaned forward slightly. In thermodynamics, he said, systems move toward entropy. They lose usable energy. Without input, order decays. I nodded. Yes. Aziz tapped his chest. The inner system also decays, he said. Without remembrance, the mind drifts into old habits. The NAFs takes over. So Dikr is energy input, I said. Aziz's eyes brightened. Yes, he said, and adab is structure, and community is feedback control. He said it without irony. He was describing spiritual practice as a system design problem. My engineer's mind lit up, not because he was flattering science, but because he was using it honestly. I asked, is there a final state, a stable equilibrium, enlightenment? Aziz's mouth curved slightly. You want a certificate, he said. Maybe, I admitted. Aziz's gaze softened. There are stations, he said. There is growth. But the idea of final is a trap. As long as you have a body, you have biology. As long as you have biology, you have impulses. He gestured toward the street outside. Even saints must eat, he said. Even saints can feel insult. The difference is not that the impulse disappears. The difference is that the impulse is not obeyed. That sounded less like salvation and more like maturity. Aziz added, the Prophet, he said, spoke of the greater jihad as the struggle against the self, not against others. He said it carefully, aware of how such words are misused. In his mouth it meant interior discipline, not violence. I sat quietly, letting the idea settle. Rising above judgment is not becoming weightless. It is learning not to be yanked by every current, like a well-designed system that can absorb fluctuations without collapse. 12. A glimpse of the meta-view. It happened unexpectedly, not in a ceremony and not in a crisis, but in the middle of an ordinary day. I was riding the tram near Karakoy, squeezed between a businessman with cologne and an elderly woman carrying a bag of bread. The car smelled of damp coats and metal. Two teenage boys laughed loudly near the door. A man glared at them, irritated by their volume. The boys laughed more, partly from joy, partly from defiance. The man's glare intensified. A small social drama unfolded in seconds. My mind began to judge automatically. The boys are rude. The man is rigid. Then, as if a switch flipped, I saw the mechanism instead of the moral story. The boys, high-energy young males testing boundaries, performing for each other, claiming territory through sound. The man, older male defending social norms, defending a fragile sense of control in a crowded environment. I saw it not as contempt, but as ecology. At the same moment, I noticed my own internal response, the desire to be the one who sees clearly, the one above it. That desire itself was another mechanism, status seeking disguised as insight. And then something else happened. The whole scene widened. It was as if my attention rose a few meters above my body, not literally, not mystically, more like a shift in framing. I saw the tramcar as a container of evolved nervous systems, each shaped by millions of years of selection, threat detection, status negotiation, bonding, fear of exclusion. I saw culture overlaying biology like a second code. Turkish norms of respect, youthful modern rebellion, urban stress. I saw the city outside the window, a river of people, vehicles, decisions, like a giant organism regulating heat and motion. I saw my own foreignness not as a special identity, but as another variable, an outsider node in a dense network. And with that wider view came something I hadn't expected. Tenderness. Not sentimentality, tenderness as accurate perception. Because once you see that most people are acting out scripts written by survival, it becomes harder to hate them for it. You can still oppose harmful behavior. You can still set boundaries. But hatred begins to feel like blaming rain for being wet. The tram stopped. People pushed out. I stepped onto the platform and walked into the flow, carrying the drone view like a small, steady flame. That evening, in Aziz's workshop, I tried to describe what had happened. Aziz listened, then said, "You saw the net." "The net," I repeated. "The net of causes," he said. "In Sufi language, some call it qadr, the unfolding of measure. Not fatalism, measure." He looked at me. "And what did you feel?" he asked. I searched for the right word. "Relief," I said. "And sadness." Aziz nodded. "Relief because you stopped taking everything personally," he said. "Sadness because you saw how trapped people are." He poured tea. "Now," he said, "do not turn this into pride." Of course, the ego would love to make the meta view into a trophy. Aziz's voice remained calm. "The drone view is useful," he said, "but you must also return to the trees. People live in the trees. Compassion happens there." Layla added quietly, "The point is not to escape the forest. It's to walk in it without burning it." I looked at the carpets hanging around us, each pattern a compromise between rule and variation, each knot a small decision. I thought of evolution, countless small choices shaped by selection, producing instincts we now call personality. I thought of physics, fields shaping movement, constraints shaping flow. And I thought of Sufism, a discipline of seeing, of remembrance, of reducing distortion. All three, biology, physics, mysticism, began to feel like different languages describing the same phenomenon, systems under constraint seeking balance. 13. The secret that isn't a secret. In the months that followed, I learned more about the League's history, not through official storytelling, but through fragments, as if the story itself preferred not to be pinned down. Aziz spoke of his teacher, an old man who had lived through the last decades of the Ottoman world's shadow and the early republic's sharp secular reforms. The teacher had hidden his practice in plain sight, running a bakery, teaching discipline through kneading dough. Layla told me her grandmother had attended gatherings in the 1970s, where women recited poetry that carried coded instruction, metaphors that were not merely pretty, but functional. Yusuf hinted at connections across cities, Ankara, Konya, even beyond Turkey, small circles of people studying human nature as if it were a sacred science. They did not call it a movement. Movements attract slogans. Slogans attract power. Power attracts corruption. They called it work. One night, after a long session mapping a particular mechanism, envy and its disguised forms, Aziz walked with me to the door. He stood there, hand on the brass handle, and said, "You think we are hidden, aren't you?" I asked. Aziz's eyes held mine. "We are not hidden," he said. "We are simply not loud." He opened the door slightly, letting in the smell of the street. "The world is full of people doing this work," he said, "in every religion, in every language. Some call it prayer, some call it therapy, some call it philosophy, some call it science." He paused. "We call it remembrance," he said, "and we call it adab, because without remembrance, knowledge becomes weapon." I thought of how easily intelligence becomes cruelty. A smart person with an untrained ego can rationalize anything. Aziz continued. "The secret," he said, "is not a secret teaching. It is a simple fact. Humans are programmable, and most people let the world write the code." He looked at me. "If you choose to write your own code," he said, "the world will call you strange." I felt a chill that wasn't from weather. To live differently is to threaten the social equilibrium. The group resents outliers, even peaceful ones, because outliers reveal alternatives. Aziz's voice softened. "But you do not need to be loud," he said. "You do not need to preach. You only need to become less reactive. That alone changes the field." Field. Again, physics language. I stepped outside, and he closed the door gently behind me. In the street, a man walked past carrying a sack of bread. A child ran, splashing through puddles. A cat watched from a doorstep, unimpressed. Ordinary life, ordinary faces. The hidden school was not elsewhere. It was woven into the city like thread into carpet. 14. Departure, without leaving. My contract was for a year. By the 9th month, I knew I would not remain in Istanbul long term. My mother's health had begun to decline back in Canada, and the pull of family is an ancient algorithm that even mystics respect. The idea of leaving made me restless in a new way. Before Istanbul, I measured my life in projects and promotions. Now I measured it in attention. Could I keep the drone view in Canada, where the social density is lower but the inner noise is still loud? Could I practice remembrance without the city's constant friction to reveal my reflexes? On my final week in Istanbul, Aziz asked me to come early. When I arrived, he was alone, sitting in front of the field-lined carpet. He gestured for me to sit beside him. For a while, we said nothing. The samovar hissed. The workshop smelled of wool and tea, the scent that had become, for me, associated with clarity. Finally, Aziz spoke. "You will go," he said. "Yes," I replied. Aziz nodded. "You think the work is here," he said. "I know it's not only here," I said quickly, eager to sound wise. Aziz's mouth curved slightly. "Be careful," he said. "Wisdom is also a costume." I smiled despite myself. "Then what do I take with me?" I asked. Aziz reached behind him and pulled out a small piece of carpet, no larger than my hand. It was a fragment, not a full design. The pattern was simple, a repeating geometric motif that looked, to my engineer's eye, like a circuit diagram simplified into art. He placed it in my palm. "This is not a souvenir," he said. "What is it?" I asked. Aziz's eyes met mine. "It is a reminder," he said, "of how patterns persist." He paused. "When you judge someone," he said, "touch this. Remember that the judgment is a knot. You can tie it tighter, or you can loosen it." I held the fragment carefully. The wool was dense and warm. Aziz continued. "Remember," he said, "the mind wants to be right. The heart wants to be real. Heart in his mouth again meant center, not sentiment. I nodded. Aziz looked toward the window, where a sliver of Istanbul's sky showed grey and bright at once. "You came here thinking you would study humans," he said. "You studied yourself." I wanted to say something profound in return. The words didn't come. Perhaps that was the point. Aziz stood and poured tea, the last lesson delivered in ordinary gestures. After we drank, he walked me to the door. As I stepped out, he said one more thing quietly. "Do not confuse the drone view with detachment," he said. "Detachment is numbness. The drone view is clarity." He held my gaze. "Clarity," he said, "is love without possession." Then he closed the door, and I was back in the street, back in the living city. Epilogue. Above the trees, inside the forest. Months later, in Canada, I sat at my mother's kitchen table while she slept in the next room. Outside, snow fell with the quiet certainty of physics. The house was silent except for the refrigerator's hum and the occasional crack of settling wood. The city I'd returned to felt sparse, almost empty. No calls to prayer, no ferry horns, no crowded trams. Just space. And yet the inner forest remained, my impulses, my judgments, my anxieties, ancient algorithms running on modern hardware. I placed the small carpet fragment on the table and looked at it. The pattern repeated. The knots held. I thought of ants and fish again. The childhood drone view offered by acrylic walls and ocean piers. I thought of Istanbul, where the human swarm was impossible to ignore. And I realized something that would have disappointed my younger self, who wanted dramatic enlightenment. The meta view is not a permanent altitude. It is a skill of returning. Returning to the space between stimulus and response. Returning to the recognition that people are adaptations, not villains. Returning to the knowledge that my own mind tells stories to protect itself. Returning to the choice to loosen knots rather than tighten them. This is not romantic. It is not cinematic. It is simply a different way of inhabiting the same species. Sometimes I still fail. Sometimes I judge sharply, then watch myself do it and feel the sting of hypocrisy. But even that sting has changed. It no longer becomes self-hatred. It becomes data. Aziz once said prediction is mercy. I understand now what he meant. When you can predict the human animal, yourself included, you stop demanding that it behave like an angel. You design your life with realistic tolerances. You build redundancy in your patience. You install fail-safes in your pride. You stop expecting perfection from carpets woven by hands. And on some days, when my mother wakes and smiles faintly, and I make tea the way Aziz did, slowly, without performance, I feel briefly the drone view again. Not above people, above the reflex. Inside the forest with a map in my pocket, remembering that the trees are not my enemies. They are simply where we live.
Before we close, I want to return to where we began. The Cartographers of the Mind was never just about Istanbul. It was never just about Sufism or engineering or hidden leagues. It was about something far closer. It was about the quiet mechanics of our own minds. We live inside narratives that feel original, personal, freely chosen, and yet beneath them run older currents. Evolutionary impulses, cultural conditioning, ego's need for certainty. The question is not whether these forces exist. The question is whether we can see them. If this story has done anything, I hope it has gently widened our perspective, just enough to notice the space between stimulus and response, not to rise above others, but to rise above reflex, because once we begin to see the pattern, even faintly, something shifts. And perhaps that shift is where freedom actually begins. And finally, one more thing. Every original story here on Neural Surfer is available for free, not just as an audiobook, but as a fully readable and downloadable PDF. I've always believed that ideas should be accessible, revisitable, and studied at your own pace. So if something in this story resonated with you, if you'd like to reflect more deeply, quote it, or simply sit with it in print, you can download it freely. Because stories aren't just meant to be heard, they're meant to be explored.